live episode for May celebrating Asian voices. We are so excited to be here with you today. So, hello and welcome. My name is Norma Jean Belenky. I'm the head of events here at Podbean. I'm going to read our brief intro and then I will hand it off to our host, Motzie Dapul. So, hello and welcome. Oh.
Hello, hello.
Hello and welcome everyone to
Welcome, everyone.
Storytelling Podcast Week and our May Roundtable celebrating Asian voices, hosted by Motzie Dapul of the High Night Podcast, with special guests Lee Uehara of House of NYC and one of the founders of the Asian American Podcast Association, and John Ju, creator and host of the Water Margin and Romance of the Three Kingdoms podcast, showcase the history and tradition of Chinese literature. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Storytelling Podcast Week has live stream sessions like this one with top podcasters and storytellers from scripted fiction and nonfiction podcasts from around the world, across our world and our imaginations. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Storytelling Podcast Week podcast, so make sure to check those out. Storytelling Podcast Week is brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 600,000 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. And now we'll hand it off to our host of this live stream, Motzie Dapul of the High Night Podcast. Hello.
Welcome, everyone. I hope you're all having a good day, a good Monday. I don't know if you all feel the same, but I usually feel more energized on Mondays just because I've hit like the new day. How about you? Are you a Garfield or are you something else?
I like to take Mondays off biorhythmically. I feel like Mondays are a good time to take off, but who can do that, right? We live on a Saturday, Sunday schedule, but if I had
Mhm.
my wish.
It would be the Mondays off. How about you, John?
Yeah, I feel you, Lee. Pretty. Yeah, Mondays are not my favorite days of the week.
That's fair. That's fair. But yeah, it's so lovely to have both of you. And I have some questions for everybody, but obviously, like if we get on a tangent, it'll be very fun because the tangents are usually where the really juicy stuff comes. But first of all, I'll ask each of you, please tell me a little bit about your podcast or what you're working on right now and how you got into podcasting. Who would like to go first? Because it's a democracy here.
I'll go, and then John, when you get bored, you could cut me off and jump in with your stuff. Because that's a lot. Like that, there are a lot of things to touch upon based on what you said, Motzie. So let's see if I remember the last thing. How did we get started? So my main show that I do independently from Asian American Podcasters Association, or AAP, is House of NYC, and it's basically a show about nothing. I share life's random hacks, how to's, DIYs, and tips for easier life, right? So, for example, one of my favorite episodes happens to be how to spread cold butter on toast without ripping the bread, right? We all like, do I speak somebody's language out there? Because that's my language. And so
Yes.
you have to listen. I think it's episode 69, y'all. But anyway, then you wanted to know what was the other thing? Oh, how I got started in podcasting. Is that right?
Like tell us a
Or
little bit about your podcast and tell us a little bit more about your podcast, or if that's if that's like the general gist, we can ask John and then like go on to another
Sure,
fun
sure,
question.
sure. Perfect, perfect. So basically, I started my podcast like everyone else. We had the idea and then you let time go by. And then finally, I basically started it with no idea what the title was, no idea what it was going to be about. A friend was supposed to come over that night. I had everything set up and we were going to do a podcast. And she blew me off in a most unsavory way. And I thought, you know what? I have everything set up. Let me just look at the last thing I did on YouTube and go with it. And here we are. So I am living proof. You do not have to be perfect. You can just start talking. John.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. My podcast. Right now, I'm working on actually finishing up the Water Margin podcast, which is where I retell the classic Chinese novel, The Water Margin. Um, Getting ready to put out the last episode sometime in the next couple of weeks, which will be 135 episodes. And then before that, I produced the Romance of the Three Kingdoms podcast, which is kind of the same general idea, but retelling the story of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is also another one of the Chinese classics. Um, so as far as how I got into podcasting, so I think it was like 2014, and my daughter was born the year before. So for that entire year, I just had baby brain, and didn't really do a whole lot. Like I used to do like some freelancing work and things like that, and I kind of gave all that up during that year. Uh, just had no mental capacity for it. And then around 2014, started to get some of that back and started looking for a creative outlet. And I started thinking about what I could do. And, podcasting was something that I had been interested in since the probably the early aughts. So I thought, oh, maybe I could do a podcast. And then, it was just a matter, okay, what do I want to podcast about? And obviously, you naturally think about your heritage, and you go, okay, maybe I could do something about China. Well, what can I do about China? There were already like Chinese history podcasts out there that were doing a much better job than I could ever do. So but I remember, as a child growing up in China, and just being immersed in these great classic works of literature and stories and characters, and I thought, maybe I could share that, with people. So that's how I got started.
That's awesome. For both of you, that's awesome because on Lee's side, I totally know the feeling of like kind of just starting and then just doing it and then kind of like stumbling your way into success. I think a lot of podcasters can relate to that. You find something that works and it might work better than somebody who's like really expecting to go in like with their like thousands of dollars of budget. It's like it's a whole other thing. There's a different vibe to podcasting. And with John, I absolutely like I kind of like you are so inspiring because I kind of want to do that for a lot of like classic works that I grew up with, and especially like not just like the way they're presented. Like a lot of people don't really appreciate like just how like compelling these stories can be when they're presented in such an academic way sometimes. So it's amazing what you're doing, kind of like sharing these in a space like podcasting where a lot of younger people especially are listening now. So that's like, but it's all ages, so that's really awesome. Yeah, and I wanted to ask because we are all actually from the Asia Pacific, I would say. Like we have backgrounds that are sorry, I immediately forgot what it stands for, even though I like Asian American Pacific Islander, if that's correct. Yes.
Ding, ding,
We all
ding.
have.
That's right.
Almost there. My brain is almost caught up, but yes, yeah, we all have like that kind of background, and in anything, our backgrounds influence us in a lot of ways. So, how would you say that being Asian American, or or like your background has influenced the way you do podcasting, or your stories, and or the way you present yourself?
John, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, obviously, my podcasts, draw upon my, cultural background, and what I'm sharing the stories I grew up with, in China. That's one way, obviously. And then also, just having that kind of background, I'm able to bring cultural and historical context to these stories and characters to make them more accessible. And that was one of my goals when I started podcasting, because some of these works of literature can be hard for people who did not grow up with them to get into. There are hundreds or thousands of names. There are tons of cultural and historical references that if you didn't know them, you have no idea what they mean. And so one of the things I do, during my podcast is when I hit one of these references, I might take like a 2-minute diversion and just explain, okay, here's what that means, and then of course, one thing I try to do on my podcast is just to pronounce the names correctly. And I think that is an important part of it. And also, I think when you pronounce names correctly, it actually makes the names easier to follow. Uh, yeah.
I totally agree. Yes. How about you, Lee?
Well, I'm half Japanese and I lived in Japan and I had to learn how to speak Japanese the hard way because my father did not speak to me. And so, in terms of my personal show, which is fun show about nothing. Sometimes random things come up, such as maybe food. So there's a segment I have called Hot Spots in New York City, and some of them happen to be Japanese restaurants, right? But I do talk about living in Japan occasionally when it's connected to the topic at hand. And I think that that happens to all of us, right? We bring in our life experiences, and we don't have to be Asian American or Pacific Islanders to do that with our shows. But because we are focusing on that today, I would say I do talk about sushi and ramen because I love them. And my favorite character, oh, do you know this character? This is my favorite cultural reference, Gudetama.
Oh, I
He's
love
he's
Gudetama.
Gudetama stands for, well, it means lazy egg, literally. This
Yeah.
egg is so lazy. He personifies, like, meh, not today. And his favorite thing is taking a nap with the piece of bacon as his blanket. And so, lucky for me, he's Japanese. He's from the company Sanrio, right? So I get to reference him a lot. And so, but I don't know if that's necessarily an Asian American thing or if it's just a Gudetama, hardcore fan thing. Did I answer the question thoroughly, or am I leaving anything out?
I think you absolutely did, and I love
Okay.
Gudetama as well. I believe they describe Gudetama as the voice of a generation.
Yes.
I think just about on the cusp of like the end of millennial, like millennials claimed him before before
Yes,
the Gen Zs
yes.
did. Yeah, but yes, that's very much relatable. And yeah, I'll also just answer this question because I want to say like so. For ours, High Night podcast, it is kind of different. It's a horror podcast and it's a drama podcast. But in that way, even the title High Night references my Filipino roots, and which I'm really proud of. And the main character is Filipino. She references a lot of Filipino like horror elements, of which there are like a lot. So even though the adventures take place in Toronto, which is where the podcast takes place, we tend to like put in a lot of really fun like side stories or like backstories for this character where she encountered like multiple an unbelievable amount of Filipino monsters. So it kind of like gets inserted in a little bit. And yeah, and I think it's like really great. I mean, like it is a funny question to ask, like, how does your background influence you? I'm like, that's, you know, of course it influences you. That's literally all you know. But it's always interesting because I think because everyone has such different backgrounds, like even if you're just stating the fact of your life, a lot of people will be like, oh, that's so different from my own life. And it's a good way for people to understand and like get a good insight. So that's really good to know. And yeah, like I definitely like relate to that quite a bit. And I do also want to say sorry, I do want to go on to the next question, but also kind of,
But wait,
you
can
know,
I
if
ask
you
you a question?
oh, absolutely, yeah, sure.
Okay, so your show is about horror and scary stories, and is that representative of some of Filipino culture? And is that tell us about that?
Oh, sure, absolutely. I got the entry flipped on myself. Yeah, just I do think it is like maybe not everybody is into horror, but I do think horror is a little more popular as a genre in the Philippines than let's say, I guess the U.S. or like other countries. Like it has a good amount of horror culture in it. We all have a ghost story, and even like the most skeptical people will have a ghost story. whether or not they believe it, it's a fun way to kind of relate to each other. Like, oh, all the buildings are old, therefore they're haunted. We have a lot of old churches, and therefore those are haunted. And we also have a long history of Filipino monsters and folklore. So like those are super interesting. I know of many like Japanese like monsters as well, and Chinese monsters. So it's like it's always something that interests me, and I think the Philippines has like a rich history of it as well. But yeah, like so I think it's part of the culture that I really love to dive into. Of but everyone has like a very full cultural background. So this is
But
just a specific part of it.
when you say everyone has a ghost story, do you mean what do you mean by that?
Whenever like we would come together and just tell like a creepy story, everyone chimes in with something, whether it's from their hometown, because everyone goes to a hometown that's kind of out in the like the boonies, and everyone has like, or it's from their school, which was like super old and super creepy, or from the hospital, because those are also really old. It's like it's because a lot of the buildings we used to work, live, and like live everyday life in are so old and not very well taken care of. So I think it leads to that quite a bit. But yeah, yeah. So I'll just go on to the next one. It's this one might be really interesting for John to answer as well, because it has to do with literature canon. Ooh. And I do want to like, I think you answered a little bit of this, but I do want to like kind of spotlight you for this question first. Um, as appy creators, we come from many countries that have their own storytelling traditions and like literature canon and stuff like that. So, what storytelling traditions or themes are you excited about sharing that may not be like super popular or showcased within media storytelling? Because, we are all like communicating to very global and or Americanized audience. So, like, what are some kind of traditions or, yeah, like, ideas that are very Chinese for you, John, and of course like Japanese for you, Lee, that are unique that you want to share more of?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk about one tradition that I drew inspiration from when I was conceiving my podcast, and it's that there is this long Chinese tradition of oral storytelling. Right, it started down like about 1,000 years ago. You have professional storytellers who work in tea houses, marketplaces, or entertainment centers and such. They would just be there every day, and and they just regale the crowd with oral storytelling. And then when I was growing up in China in the 80s, right, that tradition kind of carried over to the radio. And I remember when I was growing up, every day around lunchtime, everybody would just kind of stop what they're doing and gather around the radio and listen to, this storyteller who comes on and for the next 30 minutes, retell the next chapter in the Three Kingdoms or the Water Margin or some other classic Chinese work. Um, and, and so that was something that definitely had an impact on me that I definitely remember vividly. And to me, podcasting was kind of a very natural continuation of that tradition of storytelling. And so when I thought about, how do I want to approach this podcast, I definitely kind of took inspiration from like the style, kind of the conversational style, the just some of the mannerisms and the ways that those storytellers adopted. Um, and then as far as like themes go, one thing about Chinese storytelling, obviously, um, it's very much pointing back to historical events and making references to this or that previous character or historical figure or that event, and then drawing parallels. And you know and part of the thing I'm trying to do is kind of through my podcast give the listeners an understanding of those events, those characters, um, so that when they hear it, when they encounter it, they understand its meaning. So.
That's honestly awesome. And I think that's like super helpful as well, because a lot of like when the context is lost, a lot of people just don't appreciate how, especially how funny or how,
Mhm.
like relevant, or even like if there's romance, how romantic a gesture is, without like the
Mhm.
proper context. So I think that's really good, and it's really wonderful. And you bring up like radio as well, because it's so funny when
Mhm.
just when I presented this podcast to my family of like various like generations, the older ones were like, oh my gosh, it's just like the radio we used to listen to when we were kids. And these are like people in their like 50s to 70s. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So it's a nice way to kind of, bridge the gap, because podcasting
Mhm.
is still seen as a new medium, and but it's basically just like the revival of radio, which is cool. How about you, Lee?
Okay, so what is the specific question? Because I feel like we've gone all over the place.
I'm sorry. Yeah, like, are there any specific like storytelling traditions and or like methods from like your background that you've taken inspiration from? And I mean, if it's like kind of a little bit of a dense topic, you can kind of, even if it's just something that inspired you when you were younger. It's anything.
So there are storytelling traditions in Japan, like kabuki, for example, and rakugo, and I do none of those.
Fair enough. Fair
I'm
enough.
just like, this happened to me, and here I'm gonna share it with you.
That
I
is
mean,
fair.
I think there's like one Japanese fairy tale, but I don't think that's the right word. Maybe legend or something. Maybe you can share with me what you think it's called. But it's like Momotaro is this boy who was born from a peach, and he's really strong, and this old couple who could never have kids gets Momotaro. I think they find him in a creek or something, and so he's like this little boy, but he's so strong, and he's such a good little boy. Like, he helps his mom and dad and things, and the adventures he goes on. And that's the extent of storytelling in terms of Japanese traditions that I know of. I'm sure I could come up with others, but it's a fairy tale. So I don't know that I can really answer this question like John can, because his show is based on lore and things. So I'm going to just have to give John the expert answerer hat for this one.
No problem. Absolutely. And yeah, like I feel like that question was tailor made for John. So it's like like what about you guys? No, but I can answer a little bit just because we
Right.
already
Like, what about you? Yeah.
I actually already kind of covered like the answer in another one, which is like the scary storytelling is like part of it. It is like its own tradition. And also I think like the radio thing is something I realized was a common thing back in like that, like in the 70s and 60s, before like the 80s was a boom in like film, and then it died out. And yeah, like I think it's still very common, because there are a lot of Filipino horror people that I've been meeting ever since I started this podcast, and it's such a unique thing, especially just not just in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia in general. We have some nasty, nasty monsters, and everyone's like, "How? Why is this? Like, what happened like along the way down to Southeast Asia that like made these nasty monsters?" And I'm like,
Can you
I
give
don't
us an
know.
example of one? Like, I would love to learn. Like, what's like the one we should all know, and what does this monster do or represent? How can
Oh,
we, so that we can reference this monster in culture, just every day? I would love to know.
it's the most fun one I think is the Manananggal. It's kind of hard to say, but like Manananggal just means
Okay, wait,
remove
wait,
like.
wait. Could you say that a little more slowly for those of us who like what?
So it's Manananggal, and
Manananggal. Okay,
mhm,
Manananggal.
and it's basically like usually woman. She removes her upper half of her body from her lower half, and she flies around, and she looks for babies to eat. So that's the. I don't know if you like expected to hear about that in this interview, but
No, but like, so do parents threaten their kids with certain, oh, if
very
you're
much
not
so.
careful, Manananggal's
Absolutely,
gonna
they
come
do.
after you, kind of thing, like that?
Absolutely, they do. Yes, and it's also just I think a lot of the monsters are like based on fears around like reproduction, because it's like baby monsters and monsters who eat babies and yeah, that kind of thing. But yeah, just that's kind of like my short foray into what makes up Filipino horror. But yeah, they're fun though. Like they are very unique. I think not just the Philippines, but like the general Southeast Asian population. And
Wow.
yeah,
Can we
yeah.
can,
So oh, sorry,
can
go
we
on.
ask John? Can we ask John? What is a popular monster in
In China,
China?
yeah.
And then I just thought of something, but for Japan. But John, what have you got for us?
Oh, let's see, popular monster in China. Well, there's a well-known story about a white bone demon, um,
Mhm.
who is who basically like suck your blood and take your form. And
Oh.
yeah, and then and of course, there's always like tales of like fox demons who assume the shape, the appearance of like beautiful women and blah blah blah, that kind of thing. Yeah. So
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's also a thing in Japanese mythology as well, right? Like that's a shared
mhm.
thing between
Yes,
the
gotta
two.
watch out for those foxes. And then like the
Mhm.
word oni is like not devil but demon. You have to watch out for the oni. But that's it. That's all I have on that.
That's fair. That's fair. I do enjoy some Japanese stories like the Kuchisake Onna. I don't know if you've heard about that one. Uh, she's like she got her like her smile like the Joker essentially, like this open smile. Anyway, let's like go back on track a little bit. I'm sorry, but yeah. But yeah. So the next question is, I think I will ask this specific one. I think I'll just kind of reframe this question a little bit because it just says, what lived experience do you want to share? But that's kind of a little too broad. I would say more like, is there any story from your experience in podcasting? Is there any particular story that you want to share that was like in a meta, not in like the story, not in the podcast itself, but like your experience? Like, was there an unusual or unique or even really positive experience ever since you started the podcast that you want to like chat about a little bit?
I would say, there's not necessarily a specific instance, but one thing that really you know gives me joy and helps me keep stay motivated is when I get emails from listeners who say, yeah, either say, thank you, I've been interested in these things for years, but just could never get into them. But then your podcast helped me, provide that bridge for me to get into them. Or people who write and say, I remember, my parents, telling me these stories when I was little. But then, like it could be like, I think they're Asian American, so maybe they didn't have like they weren't as immersed in it, once they got older. But now, when they discover the podcast, they, it kind of just brought back the memories. And for me, like I love like stories like that. I just love the stories that my listeners share. And then also just seeing where my listeners are. They could be anywhere from like New York, California, middle of Kentucky, or like Scotland, or just places that you're like, oh, cool. I have somebody in Scotland that's getting into these stories. So it's
Yeah, I
great.
I love that. It's I believe like the first time somebody said they liked their podcast, I was like, okay, we have to make 100 more episodes just for this one person. And yeah, like I did one of those things where you look at the ratings on Apple Podcasts, and I was like, oh, we're number 2 in fiction in Iceland. So it's like one of those things like Iceland. Well, they have great taste. How about you, Lee?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm listened to in Iceland. I don't think so.
I mean, you never know. It's like
You
it's
never
embedded
know,
into
right?
the like into
Right,
the
right.
analytics or something. Yeah.
I just forgot the question totally, but I don't think I
And
have
yeah,
an answer for it. You're asking all these like really hearty, meaty questions, and I got bupkis for you. I don't know if I'm the right guest for this, but
No, no. I mean,
what
okay,
I,
okay.
what I can tell you to
Mhm.
piggyback off John is that it is so exciting to get listener feedback. So if anyone's watching, reach out to your favorite podcast host and send them a nugget. And in that vein, I got so excited one time because somebody used the speak pipe on the website to call in, right? And they were calling in from Japan. I was like, oh my gosh,
That's
got so
amazing.
excited. So that's my answer.
No, that is exactly the correct. That is actually
Okay.
exactly an answer. No worries. You remember the question, I think, like perfectly. No, but that's amazing. Oh my gosh. And yeah, like I guess like just from an outsider perspective, I've been seeing a lot of like different people who are like in Japan who are like trying to share like a lot of the because it used to be very closed off until a certain point. So like it's actually amazing to see everyone both trying to share and trying to like get more into the country in terms of culture. But yeah, and here is a very specific question for Lee. It's just for you. um Lee, tell us about the Asian American Podcasters Association and the Golden Crane Awards. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Oh my goodness, thank you. So, AAP, Asian American Podcasters Association, is one of the few nonprofit associations or organizations in the podcasting industry. Right now, we're a nonprofit at the state level in New York, and we're one day going to get federal 501c3 status. We have to raise enough money to do that. But it is really in existence to support and showcase and encourage AAPI creators, content creators, and that's that's our mission. Just to give folks a reason to promote themselves authentically, of course. And then along came the idea for the Golden Crane Podcast Awards because I feel that an association has an award show, they have a podcast, they have a conference, they have this, and that, right? And so we were trying to put this award show together a couple of years ago. And, people thought we were crazy, but we did it. And I have to say that Podbean was a sponsor. So thank you, Podbean. Thank you so much for helping us because we're one of the few award shows that actually gives an award. Like we mailed it out. And like can I show you one? I just happen to have one sitting here only
Please
because
do.
it doesn't have a home for me to put it somewhere. So it's just sitting on a chair near my thing. But this is what it looks like from 2021. And just so you know, I noticed that as I was reaching for it, yes, I want to address the elephant in the room is I know there's a green glow. I tried to match the pod being green, but green screen is limited. So there we are. But this
Oh,
is
that's
what the award
beautiful.
looks like. This
Nice.
is one of them, one year. Wait,
Oh.
this was this year, but because again, they don't have a home. I guess the home is the chair next to my dining table. That's where it is. But this was the first one, which I really loved. And you tell me what you think. So it was like this.
That's
So it's
beautiful.
crystal. Thank you. And it's Toujours Awards Company in LA. We wanted to make sure that the awards maker was Asian or Asian American, and so
Mhm.
he's Chinese actually. So it was great to be able to put all that together, and Podbean was in the first year such a great supporter of that. So thank you, Podbean. Because of you, we were able to do this. And
Mhm.
just so you know, if you ever have an award show, when you have international winners, you must allot some money in the budget for the
Shipping.
shipping,
Yeah.
which we didn't realize. Shipping is like
It's
3
good
times more
advice.
than than the award. But anyway, so really, and the reason that the Golden Crane Podcast Award show is so great is because now that we have finished the second year, we can now take those award winners and create our 31 AAPI podcasts for AAPI Heritage Month. So we were able to compile that list. And I think that when there's an award winning tag attached to a show, people are more willing to listen. So, my advice or nugget for folks watching and listening is to absolutely answer award nomination submission calls, because you just never know. And if you don't put yourself out there, no one else is going to do it for you. And it even if you're just nominated, that nominee designation will give you so much more confidence to go out and open those doors, and it opens doors for you, right?
Exactly. And yeah, like I think me and John are gonna go and apply and right, John? No.
Well, when she showed us
Yes,
the trophies, I was like, "Ooh, I want one."
Right?
yes,
Right? Just like the idea of getting a physical trophy, I'm like, I need
yes,
to win this.
yes.
That's
In
awesome.
November. In November.
We'll remember this. We'll remember this. No, but that's amazing. Yeah, and like that's such good work too, because I think like having a community is one of the ways and one of the reasons a lot of people continue podcasting. Because I think, like many people, everyone started podcasting around the pandemic. If like obviously, like many of you are veterans, and it's been a long time, but you know that there was like a boom in like podcast creating during the pandemic. And I think I know personally many people who fell off of that because the balance was like difficult, and also just finding an audience is difficult. But like when there are like these kind of communities and awards and like all of these things where you find a specific, not necessarily niche, but like something that like matches what you are, makes it more of a community. It makes you more motivated to keep going, and I think that's amazing. So yeah.
Can
And
I also
mhm.
just add that co-founder Andrew Wong has compiled over time our AAPI show directory, which is on Listen Notes, and we have more than 780 podcasts somehow touched or created or produced or edited by AAPI creators. So you want to check that out. And
Mhm.
if you're not listed, send us an email so that Andrew can add you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we'll see if we're already there, and if we're not, me and John are gonna be there. And I'm just like roping John in here. Hey, John, come on. But yeah, okay. So this next one's, it's not a sad question, but it is like a little more like serious. Like, what are the challenges that you have both run into with the work as in podcasting? Like, what are the biggest like hurdles that we've had to overcome?
John, you want to go
Yeah,
first?
sure. So at the beginning, it was just figuring out how to podcast, right? And I was just learning as I went along and learning by trial and error. So it's one of those things. I think every podcaster who's done it, you get like 30, 40 episodes in, and you look back, oh god, I wish I had done this thing, from the beginning, or I wish I invested a little more money in a better mic right at the start, or that kind of thing, right? So but yeah, so that was the main challenge in the beginning. Now it's mostly just kind of balancing the podcasting with my day job, family life, and such. And I've done this for about 8 years now, so I figured out a schedule that works for me, a frequency that works for me. So yeah, so that's nice. And then the last one, I guess, is just probably just finding ways to kind of reach new audiences. So this is not my primary means of income, so I don't have that pressure of like, oh, I need to constantly grow the podcast. And I knew going in, like, okay, there's probably a limited size audience for this content, but but as somebody who's creating work to be consumed, to be heard, you would always like to have more people discovering it. So it's just that.
That's very true. How about you, Lee?
Yes, and I'm going to do that thing where I ask you to restate the question so I can stay on point.
Oh, no worries. What are the biggest challenges and like hurdles you've run into while doing your work with podcasting and the association?
So I think one of the biggest challenges is being acknowledged and really not asking for a seat at the table, but more like, hey, when you have a conference, make sure there's inclusion and representation. And so that's challenging because the status quo doesn't really want to hear that at times. And so that's been an interesting observation to see who in the industry is amenable and open to, oh my gosh, of course, yes, we need more representation, and who is not. Very interesting. And then in terms of challenges, I would say that the biggest challenge is encouraging AAPI creators is easy, but actually getting them to then take that step to put themselves forward, that is the challenge, because being the model minority, you don't always speak up, right? Or I just this weekend I was at Podfest in Orlando, and there was an AAPI creator, and I was just like, come meet this person who you can do a collaboration with. And the individual was like, oh, no. I was like, why? Like, I'm introducing you, do it. And so for those listening and watching this, whenever, 4 a.m. next Tuesday, so put yourself out there, and there's always going to be fear and insecurity, but just put those to the side and do it anyway, because you just never know. And the main thing is put yourselves out there. And by that I mean reach out, say hello, hey, I have this idea. What do you think? There are ways to do it while being yourself. You don't have to be as vocal as I am, for example. That's just, I have a big mouth, but not everybody does, right? So, but in your own way, be confident and own who you are and what you have to offer. And I think that will go a long way. So that is a challenge that we see. Like, just go push little prompting. And so we're here for you, and we support you all, meaning to put yourselves out there, highlight yourself. So
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I love how like every question you turn into like this rallying call for like Asian creators and like Asian American creators in podcasting, which is beautiful. I think like a lot of people need to hear it. And yeah, like I just want to like quickly answer the question. It's the same like, John, please teach me your ways, because I am running into that issue of like, oh, I got to balance my work and also making the podcast. And I mean, it's done. We're able to do it. It's just that, doing it is stressing us out every single time. So, but yeah, I think like we're still a baby podcast. So we're probably going to figure it out in a year. But yeah, and okay, so another question, I kind of want to get through all of these. Are really good, but I'll get through them before we end this session, because we're about 15 minutes off, but that's still plenty of time. I want to ask, like, what do you feel in terms of representation in podcasting, and of course with happy representation? How does it feel in podcasting compared to other media like TV and film? Like, how would you compare it? Like, are you seeing like a lot better representation here, or are you like, do you think other places are outpacing you a little more, or like kind of just, or even just not even like how they compare, but like thinking about what you've noticed about Asian and Asian Pacific representation in podcasting? Like, what do you think about that?
well, so I think that more people need to come out of the woodwork. And here's the thing, we represent a very small slice of the pie, and sliver. I don't like the word pie, but the chart, the graph, the numbers, right? But here's the thing, there are more AAPI creators than are known about, right? Because they're quiet. It's, for example, again, going to Podfest, I counted with one hand those who looked kind of Asian, right? And like, where are we? Why aren't we going out? Like, go out, be heard, be seen. And that means go to the conferences, go to where you can connect and collaborate. So did I just get on a soapbox? Let me take it down. And John, what do you think?
um, you know, I look out there and I definitely see, I think, a lot more, say, AAPI voices in podcasting than I would encounter in the traditional media. But I think, the way I think about it is that with podcasting, there's such a low barrier of entry, right? Anybody can put a podcast out there, and the work, I can put a podcast out there, and but the work, the investment, all of that is coming from me. What I would love to see more of is to have more of the big players, more of the media companies invest more resources in elevating AAPI voices.
Mm-hmm.
That's you know, I mean, I think it's good that we have that we're seeing so many API voices out there, but I think as podcasting becomes more of a business, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think you just need to. I think I'd love to see more investment from the people that have the money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And yeah, and you bring up a good point too, because like podcasting, even though I do think it's still like very grassroots in a lot of ways, it is becoming like this big thing. Like people like Marvel are getting into it, that kind of thing. All the late night talk show hosts are getting their podcasts, and only maybe one or two are like actually genuinely interested in doing podcasts. And yeah, I definitely agree. Like the difference, not just in like in a democratizing media like podcasting, you will see basically everybody kind of get in on it, but like the representation in who is being supported is a whole other thing. So I definitely agree with that. And yeah, like I think similarly, a lot of the stories that I see that are not usually represented, whether it's like from like API or like BIPOC in general, or even like queer creators, like it has more variety in podcasts, and I do agree with John that I want to see more support for it. But yeah, and here's a fun question. I think one of the last ones, but like a really fun one, which is, uh, can you shout out other creators in the space that you're really excited about, or even just like, even if not necessarily in the space, but somebody you feel very strongly about that needs more love? Who do you like? Who are cool? Who are the cool kids? And who do you want to shout out?
So I'm going to refer to two items. One is our Asian Podcast Festival, where we invite showrunners to submit for an appearance to record a live episode in front of people, like a true festival, right? And so there was one, I mean, we had several. We had Tuckered Out with Ami Tucker. We had Twins Talk It Up with David Suck Brown and Danny Suck Brown. They're twins, actually, identical twins. We had Taiwan Know Why. They're in Taiwan. It's a comedy show. But we also, there's Under the Radar podcast by Celine Teo Blocky, and then Homo Ground, which is a music podcast by Casper, and she works for Air Media. But they're and then Andy Wong's podcast, Jim. Let's see, am I leaving anything else out? Oh, and then according to our the unofficial official story, that's a fun comedy show with AAPI showrunners. But then we also have our 31 shows, the Affirmation Pod by Josie Ong. I mean, who doesn't like affirmations, right? And then we have the OG, the Ken Fong podcast, Asian America, and then we have so many more. We have a whole list. But John, what do you think?
So my recs are all like podcasts kind of have some tangential connection to like the areas I'm interested in. So one that I have loved for a long time is the Seneca podcast by Kaiser Guo and Jeremy Gokorn. They, there's a great long running show about kind of contemporary news in China, news and culture in China. And yeah, they're great. They're funny. And it's one of those podcasts that started in their living room, right? I just love like podcasts that have like kind of roots like that.
Yeah.
And then I guess another rec. It was has to do with the storytelling aspect of it, and it's the Myth and Legends podcast. So it's really good storytelling, covering everything from fairy tales to like fables and legends, and they pull their source material from a wide range of cultures. So when we were talking about like ghost stories earlier, and it kind of reminded me, I think like, oh, I think I actually remember hearing about some of those ghost stories on this podcast.
Mhm.
So that's another recommendation.
Yeah, absolutely. I love myths and legends, as you can probably tell. So I'm just like, I feel like I've heard their name mentioned
Yeah.
around. But
Yeah,
yeah.
I think they started out like as like a indie operation, and then they kind of hit it big-ish,
Mhm.
I guess. Yeah, so
I love
which
that.
is great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, here's the thing. I'm a fraud because I don't listen to as many podcasts as you would think, being here interviewing you guys. But yeah, I will recommend. There is somebody. She used to be part of this like YouTube channel, and then she made her own YouTube channel, and she does podcasting. Her name is Sapphire Sandalo, and she is yeah. Oh, you know Sapphire?
She's a
Lee?
Golden Crane Award winner.
Oh, dang. Oh my gosh. I should have known this. I'm like, I feel like I follow her on things and then I just miss out on like some of the things that she posts about. But yeah, actually just like chatted with her on like a new episode, like, about last week or 2 weeks ago. So that's going to come out soon. Hopefully. We'll see. And yeah, like obviously it's very clear that the ones I'm like mentioning are all like Filipino podcasters because I'm just like, that's the space that I'm kind of seeing more of. But yeah, I think, oh my gosh, I'm trying to think of like other ones. I'm really bad at remembering these things, but yeah, my podcasting experience is more like the things I'm very interested in, and the things I'm very interested in are so niche. that, but yeah, I would recommend like different horror podcasts, but also one that I recently found out about was I don't think, but I don't think I should recommend, or I should recommend it, but it's probably not in English, which is a Campfire Stories PH. I'll just chat them out. Anyway, a lot of people, like a lot of like, whenever I ask this question, I always think like I'm never gonna remember everyone I want to shout out. Like I'm never gonna have a full list. So the fact that Lee like just started listing everybody off her head, she's like, oh, I don't remember this question, but I remember every single person that in my
Wait,
catalog of
but
creators.
but in your defense, you don't have to come up with a list, right? Like of anybody of us, I should be coming up with the list, right?
Mhm,
And if I can throw out another one, it's
mhm,
called Saints Podcast by Eric Huang, where he goes, because this is kind of related to you guys. He goes through like different saints of time, and so
mhm.
I don't know if like there are any like horror saints or scary saints, but maybe that's anyway. But so I don't feel bad that you're not. It's, you know what? It's like that question. What's your favorite book? Don't ask that question. Nobody likes that question. It puts people on the spot. So I think we've mentioned a sprinkling of shows, have we not?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, this last question, I think we already covered it a little bit. So let's just kind of use it as an excuse to kind of like jump into the last things you want to ask each other. But we already talked about how we want to see. So, how do we see podcasting and overall media evolve as we move into more inclusive representation? We kind of like talked about it a little bit, like how we want to see more representation specifically in the podcasting space, like more funding for like Asian AAPI creators and everything. But what other things do you see, even if it's not just in podcasting, like in terms of representation, like specifically, and doesn't even just have to be general AAPI representation, like what do you want to see more represented in like different media and different spaces, like just from your own interests, from your own perspective, like what is something you want to see more of, I think, in the future?
More, just more.
Just more.
Like more API representation. Like, what do you mean by that? Like, I mean, I think the answer is we want to see more, right? So,
Mhm.
but is there like something more detailed about your question?
Ooh. Like, you know, that's a good question. Maybe something about what topics, or like what specific types of podcast or other media would you like to see more of in the future? Like what do they cover? Like, or like, for example, for me it'll just be something like, I would love to see more podcasts that deal with Filipino mythology, because that's my whole thing. But like very specific things like that you think that is either too niche that you would like to see more of, or something that you find is underrepresented in media. um
Well, I think there should be a show dedicated to boba or bubble tea, and I wonder if
ah
if
yes,
there is one, right? Or what would be great
yes.
is I don't know about
Mhm.
you, but I am a rice snob. And
Ooh.
I would love someone to just I would love someone to compare the different types of rice. Just the
Ooh.
culturally, like what kind of rice do they eat in the Philippines versus like the rice patties in Japan or like Chinese rice. I don't know. What do
Mhm.
you guys think? I mean, rice you could just do so much
That's
with, no?
I love these topics, and I just want to say, like, like milk tea is the favorite drink of my protagonist, because it is my favorite drink. And I've like dabbled with the idea of just making a whole show where I just go around Toronto like trying new milk tea and just being like, this is good. Anyway, just as an excuse to do more milk tea stuff. But yeah, sorry, John, how about you? I feel like you had like a question ready from the get-go and are just like
Oh no,
an answer. Sorry.
I had nothing. So what was the question? What would I like to see more of? Is that
Yeah, in like media in like whether
right?
it's podcasting or something, or like film, TV, even games, anything like that.
Mhm. Right. Hmm. I mean, I, I would say taking source material from a wider range of cultures, right?
Hmm.
Whether it's video games or for instance, like if there's some idea, like with something like the water margin, like I would love to see that turn into a video game. I feel like that'd be a great video
Ooh.
game. Like, I mean, there have been video games, but not like the kind of video games that are not anything recent. I don't think so. But
Hmm.
yeah, so when we're thinking about like, oh, the next TV show, the next Netflix series, or the next podcast, right?
Hmm.
Think about where we draw the source material from. Yeah, that's really
I I
what I
totally
have.
agree. And yeah, like I said, like for me, it's like I'm always watching every single Filipino mythology like related thing, just being like,
Mhm.
there's a D&D, so I was like, what do you call it? Like a tabletop module that somebody's made that's based on Filipino mythology. And I was like, I don't play that, but I'm gonna play it. That kind of thing.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think we are kind of heading into like the end of this the end of this live stream a little bit. But it has been extremely wonderful. Oh my god, Norma, you are here. You've this
I'm
we've
here.
missed you. But yeah,
Yes,
I
we
was I'm so sorry. I just want to say like thank you so much everybody, because this was an awesome. I love that we kind of just like stumbled into horror halfway through and just be like, this is my house. But yeah, it's great to meet everybody, and I think Norma's just gonna close off this particular show. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to read our outro. This was such a beautiful panel. Thank you all so much. And I think we're all waiting for the show. Yes. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this live stream celebrating Asian voices, hosted by Motzie Dapul of the Hainai podcast, with special guest Lee Uehara of House of NYC and one of the founders of the Asian American Podcast Association, and John Zhu, creator and host of Water Margin and Romance of the Three Kingdoms podcasts. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Storytelling Podcast Week has live stream sessions just like this one, with top podcasters and storytellers from scripted fiction and nonfiction podcasts from around the world and across our imaginations. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Storytelling Podcast Week podcast, so make sure to check those out. If you joined late or want to have another listen to these amazing podcasters and storytellers, you can replay this live stream on Podbean's YouTube channel and on the Storytelling Podcast Week podcast. Storytelling Podcast Week is brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast and monetizing platform and home to over 600,000 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and stay tuned for next month's live panel from Storytelling Podcast Week on June 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern with Stories of Pride with Anna Deshawn of The Cube, some special guests from The Cube, and Nicholas McInerney of Rainbow Dads. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you
I'm going to
so
end
much.
this